Good evening. Thank you for joining the first of the Hamilton Reads 2021 finale events. This is the first of 4 online conversations around the themes in Blaze Island. Tonight, Blaze Island author Catherine Bush will speak with 3 nature writers, Daniel Coleman, Helen Humphreys, and Isaac Yuen. My name is Nancy, and I'm tremendously pleased to host these 4 writers in a conversation about words and the world. I will take a moment to acknowledge that the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. I'm pleased to welcome our authors and encourage you to find their publications at local independent bookstores like Epic Books at their Locke and Sherman Avenue locations, King West Books in Westdale, The City and the City on Ottawa Street, and all retailers that support books and literacy. Daniel Coleman loves the poetic power of narrative arts to generate a sense of place and community, social engagement, and especially wonder. As a reader, writer, and teacher, he is compelled by the long, slow process of unlearning naturalized inequities, and he has witnessed how new ways to learn can still transform apparently unchangeable situations. During the COVID pandemic, he's divided his time between the computer screen and outdoors. Helen Humphreys is the author of 19 works of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, including Rabbitfoot Bill and the Frozen Thames. She has won the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, a Lambda Literary Award for Fiction, and the Toronto Book Award, and has been shortlisted for the Governor General's Award, the Trillium Book Award, and the CBC's Canada Reads. She is the recipient of the Harbourfront Festival Prize for Literary Excellence. Humphreys lives in Kingston, Ontario. A first-generation Hong Kong Canadian, Isaac Yuen's short fiction and creative nonfiction have been published at Gulf Coast, Orion, Shenandoah, the Willowherb Review, Tin House, and other literary publications. His essay on the More Than Human World have been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, a Best of the Net selection, and a noted in the Best American Science and Nature Writing Anthology Series. Isaac was a 2019 Nature Writer-in-Residence at the Jan Michalski Foundation for Literature in Switzerland, and currently serves as Associate Fiction Editor at Tahoma Literary Review. He is at work on the Sound Atlas, an essay collection and collaboration exploring the natural and cultural history of unusual sounds. Catherine Bush is the author of 5 novels, including Blaze Island 2020, a Globe and Mail Best Book, and The Rules of Engagement 2000, a national bestseller and New York Times notable book. Her books have been shortlisted for the Trillium and City of Toronto Book Awards. She is the coordinator of the University of Guelph Creative Writing MFA, located in Toronto. Her work has appeared recently in Terrain, Brick, Emergence, the Dalhousie Review, the New York Times, and other publications. Her essay, Writing the Real, about writing climate fiction, is out in Best Canadian Essays 2021. I'll pass the conversation over to Catherine, who will begin the conversation. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Nancy. And it's lovely to be here this evening with all of you and with Daniel, Helen, and Isaac. And so, yes, we're here to celebrate nature writing and writing nature. And to begin, I'm going to ask each of our 3 writers to read briefly and then describe the work that they're reading from. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. And what a huge pleasure it is to be on this Teams call with Isaac and Helen and you. It's a real honor to me, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to wave this book cover in front of the camera. It's called Yardwork. It was written here in Hamilton, published here in Hamilton. It's a very, very local book, so local that it's literally about my backyard. And it's Anybody who does nature writing knows that the minute you turn your eye to anything, it grows so huge, it's overwhelming. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to try to retain the scope to a small scope by attending to my backyard. I'll just read a few lines from it, and then we can pass on to other topics of conversation. But this is from the end of the book where I say, everywhere you turn your eye, it's like this. Each being is distinct, utterly itself, never duplicated, a whole world of its own. Your eye can stop on leaf or petal or wing or berry and never run out of wonder. Tiny weeds spring from the gap between the flagstones by the chair I'm sitting in as I write this. They are only 3 inches high. Their stems are slender green hairs, and the ends of each has a spray of pristine white flowers on top. They're so small, my eye can't really count the petals, let alone detect stamens or anthers. So I run into the house for a magnifying glass. And even with my nose 2 inches from the pungent moss and my eye peering through the lens, it doesn't really tell me who they are. So I run to the Field Guide to North American Wildflowers. The closest thing perhaps is some kind of chickweed. These flowers are 1/8 of an inch across. Through the magnifying glass, my fingertip holding their stem is a huge pink zeppelin beside their tiny filigree. They've got such deep divisions in each of their 5 petals, I think maybe there are 10. The magnification lets me see the architecture better. The field guide sections on the parts of a flower tell me the orange-brown knots on the ends of these skinny filaments are the pollen-bearing anthers. They thrust out like this to bees and other insects so that they can brush off the pollen. A bee beside this flower would be a lumbering behemoth. Down lower are the stigma pads where the flower collects pollen. Most flowers reject inbreeding by spitting out their own pollen if it gets stuck to the stigmas. And down below that, there's the bulge, the ovary, where the flower keeps its eggs. Right here, in this crack, between stones in the patio, is a weed you can hardly see without artificial help, and it's all going on. This matrix of intelligence, transformation, selection, commerce with passing insects, sex, and reproduction. It's as complex as the 200-foot oak down the hill, as intimate as anybody's bedroom. So that's a little chunk from the last couple of pages of Yardwork, a biography of an urban place. And I call it a biography of an urban place. We often think of biography as being about human beings, but part of my own learning curve is thinking about biography, life, writing, or graphics, is about, of course, all of life. Why did we think biography should be about humans? So this is a biography of a backyard. And I chose an urban place because I think many of us think that you go to, I don't know, the wilderness or Algonquin Park or somewhere to find nature, whereas we are living smack dab in the middle of it, wherever we are. So it's a book about nature in the city, if you want to put it in brief.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that beautiful introduction and, taking us into the micro world. You're in the specifics of your garden, and then you bring our focus even more inward, but to expand into a microscopic, thriving world. So that was wonderful. Over to you, Isaac.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel, for that lovely excerpt. I came across Yardwork just today, and I'm utterly already enthralled. Reading the first bit, I was highlighting sort of passages on just the intention of focusing on a small patch to sort of explore the space where, like you said, like the landscape is almost too much, but if you can focus in, that it really brings it up in that way. So I love the description of the very minute and exploring the world around that. So that's really cool. So the piece I will be reading from, it's a piece that's been published in a magazine called Gulf Coast, and the name of it is called Second Best is Best. So that's sort of the reasoning why I kind of asked to go second in this reading. So my approach is for this particular essay, and as well as this collection that I'm working on, it actually is a new collection that was just, it's going to be forthcoming and published. It's called Other Earth. That's the name of the title. And I wanted it to, it will be an essay collection where I want to blend, my pitch was that it's kind of like an earth jazz, where I'm mixing a lot of different things together, like almost too much. I want it to be quite kinetic and busy and chaotic, and using wordplay and playing with the earth as well. So earth play and wordplay is sort of the theme around this. So it's a little bit chaotic, and I enjoy writing it as well as, yeah, just thinking about it. So I'll just read the first excerpt of it. It's called Second Best is Best. Sometimes being at the top isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Like if you were declared the world's tallest mountain one day by a Bengali mathematician, and then named for a British surveyor you will never meet. The natural outcome of this is that tourists will start clambering all over you, ascending your north sides and south sides, leaving trash tents and oxygen tanks and corpse after popsicle corpse on your slopes. No, sometimes it is better to trail 1,000 feet below and cultivate your image cautiously, like how K2 worked its magic on Italian mountaineer Fosco Marini over the years. Just the bare bones of a name he waxes about Earth's second highest peak. All rock and ice and storm and abyss. It makes no attempt to sound human. It is atom and stars. It has the nakedness of the world before the first man, or of the cindered planet after the last. There's nothing quite like when someone takes the time to understand the persona you're trying so hard to project. In this case, rarefied and insuperable. So that's just the beginning, and then I go into some crocodiles, and then there's some peppers and poisonous snakes, and I forget where it goes next. So that's sort of the intent of the collection, to highlight and connect in random and strange ways, just to explore the mysteries and the wonders of the more than human world, while also incorporating some human elements into it. I think we don't perhaps do that enough when we're doing nature writing, but I'll get to that maybe a little bit later.
Yes, I would love to hear you talk more about that. And, you know, Daniel has already noted that nature is not something that's out there, you know, a wilderness, you know, away from cities, but has incorporated the urban into his thinking about nature. And Isaac, you used the beautiful term, the more than human world, and which I think is so resonant and necessary, and but bringing it into relation with the human also is important. So yeah, I'd like to pick up on both those things. But first, I would like to turn to Helen and invite you to introduce and read briefly from Field Study, your beautiful, beautiful new book.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you for those readings, Isaac and Daniel. Those were great. I enjoyed them. This is my book. Maybe you can see it. It's called Field Study, Meditations on a Year at the Herbarium. And I was looking for a way, well, maybe I'll just read, I'll read first and then I'll explain it, I think. This is right from the very beginning. The autumn leaves floating down over the field look like brightly colored birds falling to earth. We have just left the pine wood and are on the path that my walking companion calls Carnage Alley, because there are often feathers or blood or bits of dead animal on this route. The victims of coyotes, perhaps, or the owls that hunt above this field at dusk. Easier to catch something in the open than in the tangled rack of forest trees, and even now there is a northern harrier skimming the tops of the asters and milkweed. We always consider it lucky to see the harrier, so we stop to watch its low, silent glide. It seems otherworldly, an owl's head on a hawk's body, the elegant drift of its hunger. This place of woods and meadow and marsh is paradise, my paradise, where I walk every day all through the seasons. It always seems to be teeming with wildlife and plant life, but things have changed even in the handful of years I have been coming here. Now there are deer ticks on all the forest paths and in the open fields. The toxic wild parsnip is creeping through the meadows, and an invasive feathery reed, Phragmites, is choking out the wetlands. The bobolinks and meadowlarks, who used to be plentiful every summer, are now virtually non-existent. Habitat loss, pollution, climate change, human overpopulation, and encroachment. These are some of the main reasons for the decline and changes to ecosystems. Much of the damage is irreversible, and the prognosis for the future is grim, and yet I believe there is still a profound need within human beings to connect to the natural world. How to reconcile these two things? Increasingly, this morning walk I take through the woods and fields with my dog and a friend has become crucial to my physical and mental health. Without it, I have difficulty handling all the stresses of this world and all the losses that have occurred in my own life. I think I'll stop there. So that was my question, how to reconcile those two things. Increasingly, I am in nature, and increasingly it becomes important to me, and increasingly I become aware of all the ways in which we have, screwed things up. So I decided I wanted to find a way to talk about human beings and nature through time. I was interested in that. And I went to the Herbarium as a place where I could look at this. And a herbarium is a dried plant library. Mm-hmm. And it's each plant that's collected in the herbarium in this big dried plant library has been put on a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper is a little card at the bottom right corner that the collector has put information about the plant, sometimes about themselves, and sometimes about random things. And so it's a way to show, it's a kind of crucible to show humans and nature through time, because it's the moment where an orchid was plucked from the forest floor, a piece of willow was cut from a branch. So I went to the herbarium that's near me, which is the Fowler Herbarium, and I looked through 144,000 plant specimens over the course of a year. And the book is my finding. I treated it like a kind of wilderness, and I wanted to see what I would find, and the book is the result of what I've found. I also have to say that they've published a lot of, in the book, it's heavily, if I can find a thing, it's heavily illustrated with specimens from herbarium specimens, such like this on almost every page. So that's my book.
Yeah, it's really gorgeous. I'm just trying to see if I can. Yeah, this is one of my favorite illustrations that I just want to share, which is of the lichen. I don't know if people can see that, because it's beautiful in its density and decorativeness, and again, illustrates literally some of the wonders of the more than human world, of which lichen are definitely some. So I just thank you to all of you for those beautiful introductions to your work. And we've already got a sense of something of the complexity of what nature and nature writing might be, but I want to push at this idea of what nature is a little further and just hear a little more from each of you. I was looking again just at the etymology of the word from the Latin natura, coming from the past participle of nasci, to be born, natus, so there is this relationship between nature and birth and living. And as Daniel says, often we think about nature in this binary, nature's out there, humans are here, or nature is some wilderness and it's not in the cities. And so I'm just curious maybe I'll start with you again, Daniel. When you think about nature, and especially in the context of writing, like what is nature?
Why not try an easy question? What is nature? I'm pretty simple about these things. It seems to me that nature is life force. It's the energy that makes itself. And so that is in us just as it is in anything else. And I guess one of the things that I'm fascinated about with that is that some parts we speak of living, the living beings, and then non-living, like say stone or mineral. But those two, you know, if you think in terms of atoms and the energy that's in atoms, everything is energy, you know, and it has both the capacity to generate livingness and to be constantly dying too, right? You know, and so to me, that whole cycle maybe is nature, and then the way it expresses itself is manifold. You know, that's why I was so saying, you know, you look at the tiniest thing around you and it grows into a universe the more you look at it. And so the interconnectivity too is another major thing of nature for me, that one life becomes part of another life, becomes part of another life. And so you soon get to that kind of overwhelming ecological sensibility that the interdependency of lives makes up, you know, the large world we're in. Okay, that was,
Yeah.
I'm going to stop right there because I'm getting out of my scope.
I'll just say that one of the things I noticed in the excerpt that you read is you describe the plants not as it, but you ask who they are. And so, you know, they're gently personified as having being and personhood in that way. Isaac, over to you with that, you know, my amazing huge question. But again, you know, just you talk about the more than human world, and I guess I'm curious what attracts you to that language, that way of thinking about the world.
That's a good question. I was thinking of what Daniel was saying too, in terms of how the term nature is kind of like it's a useful tool, I believe, for describing certain types of, you know, natural phenomena or things out there that are sort of useful for observation. Or but for me, like, I have to speak from my personal perspective. I think we all have to. I'm drawn back to the thing that Daniel was saying about you know, the city and nature. And I grew up with a definition of nature. I grew up in Hong Kong, so it was a very sort of city life. So my version of nature growing up was the park. Not even the park. It's like the tree next to my grandmother's house or apartment. Like, that was the source of nature that I had to work with. And I remember, you know, this was what nature was for me for the first 7 years of my life. Or, you know, I would go to parks as well, but they're all very controlled. But as a child, I didn't know that. But when I moved to Canada and went to Vancouver, it was like, oh, this is my first backyard. You know, like, this is the first kind of space where it's open. And then to me, then that became nature. And then later on, when I like expanded out my definition, it's like, oh, now I go to places where it's like humans have not touched it, as in my thinking. So that became more of nature. So I think nature for me always was sort of the other in a certain sort of type of space where I venture into, only to realize, like, as I matured or sort of thought differently, is that we keep expanding out this definition, but it's also become part of me. Like, I am nature as well. And the term immanence or eminence is the term that really rings true to me now. It's a useful division in some instances where I say I'm here, nature's there, in some terms, but more and more I feel like that interconnectedness, that blurring of the line, is really where I'm thinking about nature on that front. So
lovely. Yeah. So we get Daniel's interconnectivity and your blurring, both beautiful. Helen, over to you. What is nature?
What is nature? Such a hard question. I think I would have said, before going to the herbarium, I would have said that nature was life. It was all life. I agree with Daniel that it's like human and other than human. It's the life force. It's the anime. But when I went to the herbarium and I started looking through the files of the dead plants, many of whom looked exactly as they had when they were alive, and they were 100, 200 years old, pressed it, you know, there was like a grass would be still bending the way it would bend in a wind, and that it was 200 years dead. And a pine that was 200 years dead would still smell like a pine. A pussy willow 150 years later is still soft. So then I started to think that nature extends into death. It's not just what is life or life. It still exists. Like the dead took up as much space as the living, and sometimes there was really very little to distinguish them, but one and the other. So I started to think about nature expanding, about really occupying the realm of the living and the dead, and that there was an equality between those two realms that I hadn't really thought about before, that they felt equal to me. Like it was hard, you know, to look at a flower in the field and a flower in the files and think that there wasn't that much separating them, right? They were very similar. So especially when things smelled as they had always smelled, or felt the way they had always felt. So
that's so uncanny, even to contemplate that. Wow.
Yeah.
What a beautiful thought. Yeah, and just to bring the dead into our relationship to nature as well, and that makes me think. I mean, Helen's project expands into history, but one of the things that I felt so notable about your book, Yardwork, Daniel. I mean, yes, you spatially were concentrated on this very small. I mean, small in some ways, but geographic place, but you expand deeply in time. So you expand into geological time, and also, you're incorporating indigenous histories and presence in this land. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about those elements of your project as a nature writer and their necessity.
Sure. I mean, some of it is literally suggested by the topography where I live. We have the Niagara Escarpment creating a 300 to 600 foot cliff face all around this city. So you can literally look at the land and see layers of story, layers of history that are human and more than human right there, and put your fingers in where the sea slugs, when this was a tropical sea, used to burrow into the mud. That's speaking of the dead that are still in the life of the place. This is physically in the place. And it makes me think of that wonderful statement by Gary Snyder, the nature writer and Buddhist poet, who says any place is basically a palimpsest, that it's written upon by ice ages, it's written upon by forests, it's written upon by animals, it's written upon by plant life, it's written upon when it's made into a parking lot, it's written upon when it's turned into buildings. These are all layers of the story of any place. And so in a way, attending to a place gets that multi-layered sensibility so quickly. And I have to say, particularly about the indigenous histories that are deeply woven into the book. I mean, my whole impetus to write this book is, I'm an English professor. I'm a person who was taught that learning meant you go to the library and you read something. And I think we probably, as writers, have a lot of that in us. We love the book culture and the paper and the pencil, and that kind of, it was our education. And when I arrived here in Hamilton over 20 years ago, I was fortunate to meet Haudenosaunee colleagues very early on when I came here, who would say things like, well, the land is your teacher. The land is education. And I thought, well, I wasn't trained that way. Like, how do I learn anything about land or nature as teacher? And so really, yard work is the exercise of trying to learn how to understand where I live as a teacher. And that included the long and sophisticated and complex presence of Indigenous people and their understandings of this land. So it's part of the story. clearly part of the story of the place. And then that raises a lot of questions. As we all know, there's tensions between whose story do we get to tell, and how do you be responsible to the kinds of stories that you're evoking about any place that we live. Yeah, so thanks for the question. I love that image, though, of place as a palimpsest, or as a place which has been written upon layer after layer of writing, and not just by human pens.
I think I'm going to turn to Helen and then go to Isaac, because Helen, your project is also historical, and one of the interesting things about the herbarium is, you're seeing the land not only through the plants pages, but through the collectors, and so you're looking at the land and yeah, all these preserved plants that were gathered by all these historical people, and their presences certainly come through in the project. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about them as the lens for seeing the natural world.
Yeah, what was interesting about there's so many things interesting about the herbarium, but one of the really interesting things for me about the herbarium was that a lot of the plants were collected, probably half the plants were collected by amateurs, and then half by professional scientists, because in the kind of settler botanical craze that happened in the 19th century, a lot of amateur collectors started collecting plants and becoming knowledgeable about them. And sometimes, at one point, the leading expert on willows was a man who worked in a bank, and he had his own little wild willow patch that he had made himself. We had 2,000 different kinds of willows, and he was trading in willows all over the world. And people like the director of Kew was asking him for his opinion on some willow, right? And then when he died, his herbarium got dispersed, and some of it ended up at Queen's. But so it was full of these kinds of the passion. This is what I was finding, like the passion of the collector, of the amateur collector. But also it was a time in this kind of moment where the amateurs were as respected as the professionals. And so there were many diverse people doing plant collecting and being interested in plant botanizing. That was a verb, botanizing, to botanize. And so I thought it was this moment where there was a kind of democracy, actually, it was a democratic moment in this particular thing, where you could be someone who worked in a bank. You could be a woman who never ventured beyond her yard, and like Mary Treat in America, who wrote 3 books about her yard, about how interesting it was, and said you never have to really venture past your yard to see the most interesting things in the world. So you could be kind of anyone who was passionate about plants and plant life, and you could sort of make your way that way. So.
Yeah, just following when I was reading about that willow story, you didn't even get to the most heartbreaking part, which was it the farmer who bought his land and then just ripped out all the willows that he planted?
Yeah.
Oh, I read that, and I just wanted to weep. Got me in the gut. Isaac, one of the things I read you describing your work, you talked about your interest in other people's representations of nature, or, I've read a bit, you writing about the Studio Ghibli films and how nature appears in them, or I think you mentioned that you're interested in the way nature is represented in video games also. And so I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that side of your interest in nature.
I think, yeah, this is again talking a little bit about myself again, but I came across nature writing through the standard channels, the romantic sort of variety of wonder and wandering around a landscape and paying attention to the small things. And I really sort of became enamored in that, how the minuscule small things become worlds. In that way. But then I also wondered, like, there's a tradition, I grew up on this, all these stories is like Walden and Thoreau, and that sort of narrative, that the solo male out in the wild sort of narrative. So then after a while I was like, maybe there's other forms of telling stories about nature. So, and then I looked through I did a lot of reflecting before I started writing. I started writing as sort of just a passing interest. I was like, oh, I think I wanted to do something that I felt really passionate about and explore why I was passionate about it. So stories came up as a thing. So I began looking at stories that contained elements of nature writing or themes around nature. And I just found a bit of diversity in the stories that I was drawn to, or the themes within those stories that had a kernel of appreciation for nature. So that means I was kind of opening up myself to different forms of media, which when we think about nature writing, it's, you know, books, book learning, and in a library. And I was like, there's more out there, and in different media as well. So I began, you know, exploring different media, and I just reflected on what I liked. And so Studio Ghibli films, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, it's a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them are crafted by a Japanese animator and storyteller, Hayao Miyazaki, and he creates these films and he draws these films, and the film might not be specifically about nature. Some of them are specifically ecological, environmental stories, but some of them are not. But he still pays a similar attention, incredible amount of attention to the landscape that he's depicting, the atmosphere of it. He would lock in a shot of nothing but, you know, like a scene when the water comes, or the river. Just like there's a prolonged intensity and focus on something, because the point of this also actually is that he has to make it out of nothing. You know, this is a creation that he draws, and it comes out of some sort of inspiration, and then he crafts it in a way where he pays as much attention to what we say the ordinary, like a landscape, to an action scene or anything else. And to me, that was very interesting and captivating. Someone that is able to pay attention to the small details in a different way, you know, in a creative way, where they had to craft another world out of it. That goes the same for certain video games, which deservedly, the genre is not the most adept at telling very nuanced stories. Like, there are some limitations to it, but there's also a lot of possibility for interactiveness, which I felt really drawn to. It involves the player or the avatar, whatever, to engage in the world in a certain way or a free way. And I thought that was very interesting as well. So I'm always interested in exploring different ways of engaging with the themes around nature, or our perceptions of it, or our just how we perceive it overall. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, again, it's lovely to have that expansive sense of what nature writing might be, and yeah, that's beautifully articulated. I'm interested, you know, Daniel, in your book, you talk about your desire to belong to a place, and you know that comes through, I think, very strongly in Yardwork. And Helen, you know, I think you've lived where you live for quite some time, and you talk about that practice of walking in the same place in the opening to Field Study. And Isaac, it seems that you're more someone who's moved from place to place, so have less of a relationship to belonging in one place. So I'm curious where, you know, your relationship to place intersects with your nature writing. Daniel, do you want to start us off?
Oh, sure.
The desire to belong.
Well, for people who don't know, I grew up in Ethiopia, the child of Canadians who worked there. And so in our family, we would talk about home, and home didn't mean where we were living. Home meant where Grandma and Grandpa and all them were over in Canada somewhere. which was a place I'd never been. So the home was this weird thing. Like I guess looking back as an adult, I would say it was a ancestral or cultural concept, and the domestic idea of where you live and where you have breakfast, you know, was a secondary idea of home. And then in my teen years, the political life in Ethiopia was very turbulent, and so I had every year of school in a different school. So I was constantly adjusting to different places, for a while in Canada, for a while in Ethiopia, for a while in Kenya. So we bounced around a lot, let's just say it that way, not by choice or even by, you know, like some people, it's because their family is transferred from one job to another or something and they move. It was kind of volatile moving because of, well, scary politics. And so I think then I came to Canada. I went through, you know, the processes many people go through, which is deciding what kind of education to enter into and then pursuing school here and there and somewhere else. So I lived in Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and then ended up arriving in Hamilton in the mid-1990s. And kind of because people in university jobs don't move too easily, you know, realizing this is where I'm going to be for quite a long time, maybe the longest ever. And in fact, that's turned out to be the case. I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere in my life. And so I think there was a desire in me to say, what is belonging? What does it mean to belong? And how does belonging sneak up on you? And some of that is that a place can attract you. You know, I think many people have had the experience of going to a place they've never been before and feeling this strange affinity, you know, or feeling very alien because the plant life or the built cityscape is just too unfamiliar or whatever it is. And I remember one of the meanings of the work of yard work is the work of attending to place, really, as an exercise in belonging. I think that my partner and I decided we want to belong here. And for many who have seen Hamilton from a distance and haven't lived in the city, it's not a immediately attractive place. You know, the pollution-scape of hyper-industrialization has just made the place hard to immediately be attracted to. So that was a process of writing towards belonging, I would say.
It's funny when I think of Hamilton, though, I'm also, you know, aware of the botanical garden and Coote's Paradise. And, yeah, you know, yeah. I have these, you know, memories of when I was writer in residence there and spending a lot of time in the urban wilderness of Coote's Paradise with my dog and feeling the whole city of Hamilton fall away and, you know, thought I could get lost in there for days. So there's, you know, all those, you know, beautiful natural surprises in that place as well. Helen, you were talking, you know, when you were reading from the opening of Field Study, you were talking about the, you know, the walks with your dog and the sort of the necessity for your own health of this practice of walking in the nature of a place. And I wonder if you could open that up for us a bit more in terms of your relationship to this place, which sounds, you know, like that it need, you know, you need this relationship with the natural world in terms of your own health.
Yeah, I was born in I was born in England, though. We emigrated when I was small, and so all my extended family still live there. So I've always had an uneasy relationship to home because it was never clear to me where it was exactly. So the thing that happened, though, when I got dogs was that, of course, dogs, as you know, have to be walked and they need a routine and they have to, you know, get out there in the world. And so I started going out into the world more. And there is this one place that I walk because it is a mixture. I like that it has the lake is there, it has meadows, and it has forests. So it has 3 different little landscapes. And so I like that mix of landscapes. And so I guess I just went there enough that I started to notice, you keep noticing more and more things. I started to recognize the animals, particular animals, right? That I could recognize, like the harrier, when the harrier comes, and how often that happens usually. And in the winter, we're coming up now to the time of year we start to see the owls, and that's always exciting. And so that sort of took on larger meaning, I guess. And then I had a lot of deaths in a kind of decade period. I lost maybe 5 or 6 people, close people. And so it's just life is this balance of things, right? And you never know like how the balance is getting made. It keeps getting made and remade and shuffled around. And so the balance, in particular balance, became the sort of deficit of the dead people on one side, and then this extra sort of presence of nature on the other side. And that's sort of where the balance is for me now, I guess. And that natural world in that particular place where I go every day for 2 hours, rain or shine, snow, whatever, that particular place, because I know it so well now, that has taken on a greater meaning for me, I think, and had greater emotional resonance.
Yeah, and I was thinking, and I meant to ask you directly too, but you've answered already about, how your life with dogs, animal companions, shapes your relationship to nature and a place. And because it does seem to be a striking and it is a way of being in the world that demands a relationship with. That dogs want to go out into the natural world, and you need to engage with the world along with them.
Yeah, and dogs show you things you wouldn't have seen otherwise, right?
Yeah,
They found that, they find a little path where a rabbit's gone down, or, they find a carcass of something. And so there's all these things that come your way just because you're with the dog that wouldn't come your way otherwise.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting because, I too am from an immigrant family, and certainly in my thinking about my relationship to the natural world and the writing I've done is shaped by the fact that I don't have a history on this land either. My people are also from the British Isles, and I'm the sort of first generation to be here. And so it's how do you care for and love and pay attention to a land that isn't yours, but where you also don't have that personal history. And Isaac, it sounds like you've gone from Hong Kong to Vancouver. Now you're in Berlin, and you've been in Switzerland. And so I'm curious about how your relationship to nature is been shifted by your move from place to place.
It's so interesting to hear everybody's uneasy or complicated relationship with home, the concept of home or a place, because that's totally also my experience, almost to the point where I feel like sometimes I define myself without in absence of a place, and that's a weird thing to say for a nature writer to not be writing about a place, but in some ways I also am. I'm starting to realize as the more I write. I really love this book by Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities, and it's basically just a ridiculous travelogue, sort of, where he describes 50 cities, around the world. But there's one passage in there where he's interrogated. The construct is that Kubla Khan talks to Marco Polo and tries to nail down Marco Polo. It's like, hey, you've never been to all these places before, or and he says, there's one place. Kubla Khan says there's one place you've never written about or told me about, and he's talking about Venice, the home place. And Marco Polo goes, what do you think I've been writing to you or describing all this time for these other 50 places? I think that idea of that I think the writing or describing or living, whatever it is a grappling of where home is in some form. Like for me, I feel like, Helen, you're talking about loss and you know, I haven't been back to Hong Kong in a long time. And then there was a period where a lot of people passed away, and all I went back for was like basically funerals. But that really intensified my relationship, or forced me to confront sort of what connections I had with this place, through loss, through death, and what I left behind. You know, as a child, I didn't think about that. Obviously, it wasn't my choice, but it was just one of those things where it really made me question my connection to place, and why these memories I have as a child, or childhood memories, informative memories, really shaped who I am without me being, you know, aware of it. And when brought back to those places in a time of loss, these are the places I gravitated towards or held extra meaning for me. And then I started writing about these places as well. And that sort of was a very cathartic process, a grieving process. And I think, you know, speaking of nature writing, those are important elements of it as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say to our audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Because I don't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment. I do encourage you to add them, but I'll ask one more question, and sort of following on from, you know, touching on grief and loss, and you know, Helen had spoken about this earlier, you know, just about the larger climate of climate grief and loss in which we're operating. How you respond to that as nature writers, and in a sense, I mean, Daniel's spoken of wonder and Isaac as play, and you know, there's an attention to, you know, attention and acts of reparation in Helen's book. So I see there are questions coming in, but I wondered if you could each talk just very briefly to what is you feel that we need in this, you know, greater climate of possible climate grief. What do you feel we need from nature writing? Daniel, do you want to start us off quickly?
Okay, you keep asking these very, very big questions.
Yeah.
I just want a really quick little answer, you know,
well, yeah.
like a one-word answer.
It's a great question, because in a way, I would say that's where the book got its start. You know, you were saying about how Hamilton has so many beautiful places, and I had talked about the hyper-industrialization and pollution of this place. And in a way, I would say I started writing Yardwork because the place is screaming. You know, it's on the one hand so drop dead beautiful, and then it's been so desecrated and abused too, all in the same place. And you see the tension of it all around us, you know, whether that's in the air quality, water quality, you know, hyper-industrialization or urbanization, and so many things. So those things are in our face in so many ways. Of course, there's lots of ways to try to ignore them. But I guess the quickest answer I can think of is to do what, in a way, what nature writing has taught us to do, which is to pay attention, you know, both to everything, in the sense of the losses that occur. Like, I'm looking down the slope of my back place, and there's a green ash tree lying on the ground. It was wiped out by emerald ash borer. You know, there's a whole thing about certain kinds of insect infestations as tied to the kinds of climate changes that are occurring. You know, it doesn't matter where you go, you can find the symptoms of these things, and in the same place, great concern and care having an effect. You know, eagles are living in Cootes Paradise for the first time in 50 years in the period of climate change because of human efforts to clean up what has been abused place. So we live in the tension of that. That's all I can say, is trying to pay attention to it and not turning a blind eye, but staying with the trouble.
Yes, to quote Donna Haraway, yes. Yes. And this, you know, my question, which I'll turn to the others too, I'll just note that one of the questions that's come in the Q&A is asking about the contemporary relevance of what you do. And in a sense, it's another way of reframing, I think, this question. And someone else is asking about how, particularly about Daniel's book, and paying attention to the backyard can be a lesson during COVID, another reality of grief and loss in our times. So Isaac, do you want to take a stab at answering this question?
Yeah, so that's something I actually jotted down just as a sort of a thing that probably will come up in a talk such as this. So I was really interested in just drilling down to what we actually want to convey as nature writers. Like, what exactly are we trying to convey? So, wonder, mystery, despair. Those are sort of, I feel like, things that we very much are drawn to or gravitate towards as we, write. And if we have an intention to express something to our readers, and there's also something, like urgency, obviously these days with the climate crisis, also complexity, and I think for me it's a blending or blurring of the two. I think it's very important. We don't want to center the human experience for writing, because we're trying to pay attention, as Daniel said, to different aspects of the more than human world. But we do have to acknowledge sort of the full range of the human experience in our writing to make it more appealing and mainstream, I think. Harping on sort of, oh no, things are terrible and it's like it's not good. Yes, people know this. So how do we convey or trigger different types of, or convey different experiences, different relatable and human actions and stories within the context of nature writing, while still touching on those things that are very dear to all of us, addressing the impacts we have on the world. And then I think I was thinking more of the sort of two things: that the full range of human experience to convey, and also the unknown breadth of the world that we live in. We don't know anything, like nothing. Like, for all the things we know, I feel like this is a really cool example of, like, someone drew a circle, and that's the depth of human experience, everything we've collected. The more we gain, the bigger the circle grows, but the borders around the circle gets even bigger. So the more things we know, the more things we don't know. And I always find that to be such a humbling and hilarious, I think, funny thing to think. Like, we're like, oh, we're so smart and we do so much. And it's like, the more we do, the more we realize we don't really know anything. And I think that's something that's really interesting for making us humble in the face of, our mastery of the world. And then those two things, I think it's interesting to connect the two, human experience and then the unknown part of the world. And then there's a connection part to that, because, that's how we sort of engage with that, those two realities or worlds. I don't know how to call it. And also the interdependence between those two realms, like how our actions affect the collective, outside of us, and how we depend on that as well. So I don't know. This is just my blur thought of how we can address, these types of things. And I think the word that came to mind as well when I was thinking about this was surprise. Like, we need to present things in a new way. And I think that's the job of the creator, to make things novel, to make things interesting, to make things that surprise, like the world we live in. It always surprises us.
I can feel your surprise. You animate it so beautifully. It's wonderful. And yeah, humility too. Helen, I'm so, interested you talk in field study about, how the Herbarium project is a way to try to understand where we go from here. And I'm curious how you were transformed by that experience. And yeah, just, if you also would like to touch on the larger question that I asked about, what we need now. And I mean, you have begun to address writing in response to climate grief or an atmospheric grief. And this probably will be our closing comment because we are getting close to time. So Helen, you have the final words here.
Okay. Well, Daniel and Isaac said everything so beautifully. I don't really have too much to add to that, except that at the Herbarium, the thing that I realized was when I was reading about all these collectors and their passion for the plants that they had in the past, and that I realized so much of it, so much of people's interaction with nature in the past that I was finding there was about a kind of act of devotion. It was devotional. And I liked that. I took that away and thought, yeah, that's what my practice with nature I want to be, is devotional, I think. And also this idea, yes, to observe and to bear witness to the changes that are happening. I think that's another thing that nature writers can do, to bear witness. That's an important thing. And also to just kind of get out of the way of the human way and just, devote yourself to something small, like a little mushroom or a piece of moss, or, just be in awe of it and be hopeful. I think hope is important. I think despair doesn't motivate us except to despair, right? But hope does motivate us. And so I think hope is something that we always need to have, because life is a hopeful thing itself, right? So as long as we're alive, we should be hopeful.
I'm just going to read one final comment that's come in. I don't have a question, but I would like to say thank you for giving us so much to think about. It's led me to think about what my relationship with nature is and how I might one day write about it. And I too would just like to thank you all for these vivifying and inspirational comments that, even just listening to you, I feel transformed, and I want to go back out into the more than human living and dead and complex and unknown, mysterious world that's beyond us, and find myself at home and also bewildered and be wilder and all of that. Thanks again, Isaac, Helen, and Daniel, for this really fabulous conversation. It's been such a huge gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Catherine.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.